Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Toni Jordan and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Wheeler Centre this evening for a very special event. Firstly, I'd like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event takes place and also their ancestors past and elders past and present. Our guest this evening is the author of 3 books. The first one, Wild Swans, 3 Daughters of China, is an international bestseller and international award-winning book. If you can see my very well-worn copy, I've read this many times, and it was actually the very first book I bought signed, the beginning of my signed book collection. So I know this story quite well. Wild Swans was published in 37 languages and has sold in excess of 13 million copies worldwide, making it the largest non-fiction paperback selling book ever published. Thank you. Our guest's second book, Mao, The Unknown Story, is a result of a over 10-year collaboration with her co-author and husband, the biographer and historian Jon Halliday. And it's an amazing story that really raises the psychological issues of Mao in a way that has not really been dealt with before. This is another remarkable book. And the one we're here to discuss tonight, the latest one, Empress Dowager Cixi, the Concubine who launched modern China. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jung Chang. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Thank you for coming all this way to talk to us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
For those few people in the audience who might not have read Wild Swans, you're from such a line of remarkable women. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the story of Wild Swans and how you came to be where you are, starting with your grandmother.
Right.
Well, we're going to go way back in time here.
Well, the thing is, Wild Swans is the story of my grandmother, my mother, and myself. I think the stories themselves are in the book, but perhaps I should say a few words about how I came to write this book. I always wanted to be a writer. When I was a child growing up in China in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but it was impossible just to say to myself I wanted to be a writer, because nearly all writers were persecuted, sent to the gulag, driven to suicide, even executed. Even writing for oneself was dangerous. I remember writing my first poem on my 16th birthday in 1968, in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. I was lying in bed polishing my poem when Red Guards came to raid our flat. And I knew that if they saw my poem, I would get into trouble, my family would get into trouble. So I quickly rushed to the toilet to tear up the poem and flush it down the toilet. And that ended my first literary endeavor. That story is also in Wild Swans. But in the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant and as a barefoot doctor, and later as a steel worker and an electrician. When I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, I was always writing in my head with an invisible pen. But I couldn't put pen to paper until 1976, Mao died and China began to change. And in 1978, for the first time, scholarships were awarded on academic basis, scholarships for going abroad. So I sat for a national exam and I did reasonably well. so I was able to leave China to go and study in Britain as one of the first group of 14 people. I mean, that is also the story of Wild Swans, and Wild Swans ended there with my going to Britain. Now, when I arrived in Britain, of course, I had the freedom to write. But then at that moment, my desire to write disappeared. And this was because I'd come to a place that was like Mars, and everything was new and exciting, and I just wanted to spend every minute absorbing everything, and also to write for me meant to look inward and backward to a time I prefer to forget all about. And in the Cultural Revolution, my father died, and my beloved grandmother died. My grandmother, was when she was 15, she had been sold practically by her father to a warlord general to be his concubine, and my grandmother had a very hard life, but she basically brought us up, and she also died in the Cultural Revolution, and their deaths are the most painful spots in my heart. And I just didn't want to think about them. And then, of course, I was eager to have fun when I was in London. And when we first arrived, we were not allowed to go out on our own. We had to move in a group. And we were all wearing this Mao suit, this sort of blue uniform-like thing. And we were quite a sight in the London streets. And we were also told not to do this and that and then the other. And one thing in particular was not to go to an English pub, because the Chinese translation for pub, 酒吧, suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. And of course, I was torn with curiosity, and I spotted a pub across the road from the college. And one day, I sneaked out of the college. I darted across the road, and I pushed the door of the pub open. And of course, I saw nothing of the kind. Only a few men sitting there drinking beer, and I was rather disappointed, of course. And then that was, I had so many interesting experiences and was the first to do so many things. And also, when I arrived in England, the foreigners I had spoken to had only been some sailors in a port in South China, where in 1975, we as the English language students were sent to talk to practice our English, and that I also wrote in Wild Swans. And of course, for us, then China was totally closed. Sichuan, in particular, where I came from, had China's military industries, and it was especially strictly closed, and there were no foreigners around. And as far as we were concerned, these sailors were our only chance. So we would be sitting in the only restaurant, eagerly awaiting our sailors. We would grab them as soon as they came on shore. And of course, we had no idea what must be on their minds. And also that was a story in Wild Swans. And then in London, when I started to learn a little English, when universities began to reopen in China in 1973, after having been closed for many years. And our English, I became an English language student. Our textbooks had been written by teachers who had never spoken to a foreigner themselves. And so the texts were direct translations of Chinese texts. The lesson greetings was a direct translation. And the Chinese in those days, when we bumped into each other, we said, 吃饭了吗? 上哪儿去? which means where are you going and have you eaten? So those were the English greetings I learned and used in London. And then, anyway, so that was an exciting and amusing life until 1988. My mother came to London to stay with me. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life and the stories of my grandmother and my father. And once she started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day. And by the time she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recordings. And that's how, and after my mother left, I sat down and transcribed her tapes. And that's how I started writing Wild Swans.
So Wild Swans, as I said, has sold 13 million copies. None of those have been in China. I have a friend who lives in Chongqing who has a remarkably balanced view of the world, and when I asked him how he knew so much about the Cultural Revolution, he's a young man in his 20s, he said Wild Swans. Someone from America cut the cover off the book, glued another cover onto the front of the book and mailed it to him. So it's never been published in China, has it?
Well, there were pirated editions, but then the censors got strict, and so they were wiped out. There were also editions there were also people also scanned the books Wild Swans in Chinese, and Mao, the biography, which I translated into Chinese, and people scanned them into the computer for other people to download. But of course, China also has a big and huge army of censors. They just sit there deleting texts and closing down blogs and so on. So relatively few people have read Wild Swans and the biography of Mao. Of course, still a lot of people, but by comparison with the population. Yeah.
So is there an official version of your work? Is there official position that the Chinese government has on you?
Yes, I'm afraid. My books are banned. I'm on the kind of blacklist. And unfortunately, through fighting, I won't go into the detail, but I'm allowed to go back to China and to see my mother for up to 2 weeks a year. Because my mother is in her mid-80s, she's frail, she still lives in Chengdu, she can't travel long distance, and she relies on us to go back and see her. And thank God, I have that good fortune to go and see her. But of course, I also committed myself not to try to publicize my books, and not to address any public gatherings, not to speak to the press, and not to even to see most of my friends. And so that's the price, we pay for being writers and writing about these subjects.
So as well as coming from a line of strong women, this is another strong woman who is very much on the blacklist in China at the moment, the Empress Dowager Cixi. On my second visit to China, I learnt 2 things about the Empress Dowager Cixi. The first was she killed her own son in order to seize power of China. That was repeated to me a number of times. We'll come to all these allegations against her soon. And the second was that she decimated China's navy by stealing money in order to build the Summer Palace, and we'll get to that point as well. But I want to start from the beginning of her time in the Imperial Palace. She was 16. If you looked at her then, at the age of 16, coming into the imperial family, you would have never, ever dreamed she would end up ruling China for the best part of 50 years.
Right. Okay. So this is Empress Dowager Cixi. She was a Manchu, the Manchus dominated China for more than 200 years, and they didn't practice foot binding. So you could see she didn't wear those pointed 3-inch golden lilies shoes, and she had natural feet. Now, she was born in 1835, and Beijing at the time, and as you said, at the age of 16, she went through one of those periodic nationwide celebrations for imperial consorts. Like hundreds of girls from all over China, she was paraded in front of the emperor, and she caught the eye of the emperor, and she was installed in as one of his concubines, a low-rank concubine. Now, actually, the emperor didn't favor her because she had opinions. I mean, the emperor, her husband, was in dead trouble. I mean, he was invaded by the British and the French, and who burned down the old summer palace. And there were peasant uprisings like the Taiping, the biggest peasant uprisings in Chinese history. And everywhere was in chaos. And she felt she had good suggestions, but her husband loathed her for having made suggestions, and even wrote an edict to the Empress saying that after his death, if Cixi still dared to voice political views, she should be killed, even if she was the mother of the emperor, because the emperor had only. Oh, now this is the emperor. The emperor had only one son, and that son was with Cixi. And so when he died, their son succeeded the throne.
This is not.
This is, of course, not their son. Not their son. This is one of the ancestors of the Pekingese dog. You know, when the British got into the old summer palace in 1860, they found the body of an imperial concubine who couldn't flee with the court, and because the emperor and the court all fled the British. But this imperial concubine stayed behind, and there were 5 Pekingese dogs around her body. And the British took these 5 back, and they became the origins of the Pekingese outside China. And this particular one was named Luti, and it was presented to Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria had Luti painted, and specifically said Luti should be painted against something to show how extraordinarily small she was. And
so here we have.
Yes.
So let's go back to Cixi. She comes into the imperial household very young. She's not a favoured consort. She's quite low down in the pecking order, but something remarkable happens. She bears the emperor's only son. And then in a great deal of turmoil, there's an invasion of a number of the foreign powers. The summer palace is ruined and burned down, and the emperor is in exile with his court. And that's when things really start to get interesting.
Yes. Well, then when the emperor, when the British left, Cixi's husband was so heartbroken, and he refused to return to Beijing. So he died in self-imposed exile in the northern wilderness beyond the Great Wall. And their son, that the boy in blue, was 5 years old, and he was the only son, and he was made the emperor. Cixi's husband then appointed 8 powerful princesses and grandees to supervise him. And at this point, Cixi, aged 25, launched a coup together with the Empress. The 2 women, you know, in the harem, the general idea is women stab each other in their backs and, being beastly to each other. But, in fact, it wasn't like that. They made friends and they became comrades. They launched the coup together, and together they faced death by 1,000 cuts, literally, if their coup had failed. But they didn't fail because their coup was a popular one. Now, they had Cixi mainly had this idea, a common sense idea, which was, why must we keep the door of China closed and fight Westerners? Why can't we open the door of China and do business with the West to benefit China itself? And that idea revolutionized Chinese history. And it was from the time of their coup in 1861 that the door of China was opened. Now, their coup was remarkably, relatively bloodless. Out of the 8 regions, they killed 3. 1 was beheaded, and 2 were sent long white silk scarves for them to commit to strangle themselves with, which was called a 刺帛. It was considered an imperial favor.
So this is quite remarkable. So this is 2 young women who had no contact with the outside world, very little formal education, surrounded by eunuchs, and that's the way they interacted with the country at large, launched this daring takeover of the country, and ended up ruling it.
And ended up ruling it in the and here they are, surrounded. The Empress Dowager Cixi is surrounded by eunuchs. I mean.
Tell us about the throne.
Yes, in the harems of the Forbidden City, not even being allowed to set foot in the front part of the Forbidden City, where if you go to Beijing, you see these grand palaces and so on. So she never set foot in them. I mean, this is their audience hall. They were not allowed to see their officials face to face because their officials were male. So they would be, the 2 women would be seated behind this silk screen, and the 5-year-old son was put on the throne, and the officials would prostrate in front of them as a harem. But then it was from that, so that kind of position, isolation and everything, they opened up China. I mean, they introduced basically Empress Dowager Cixi. I mean, everything we can think of in the 19th century in terms of modernity, electricity, the railways, and a modern equipped army and navy, the modern way of conducting diplomacy and doing business, and factories, the mines, and she introduced the whole lot. She also sent people abroad. Her first ambassador abroad is this man standing in the middle, who's called Anson Burlingame. He was President Lincoln's first ambassador to China. After Cixi opened door, foreign countries started to send ambassadors to China. And Anson Burlingame served his term in Beijing, and when he was about to leave, Cixi made him China's ambassador to the West. So he traveled around the world for 2 years, representing Cixi and telling he addressed the citizens of New York. I mean, he said, a new China is emerging. Its enlightened government has sent me here as its representative to say, it wants to be part of the world, it wants to be friends with the world, and so on.
But this is really quite an important point, because the reason they ended up having to get an American to be the first Chinese ambassador was because of the extremely low regard that anyone who worked for the Foreign Office was held. And in fact, she really couldn't get any Chinese people even interested in going overseas. It was considered almost treasonous to want to go overseas.
That's right. I mean, for example, this man on the right is called Robert Hart. He's an Ulster man. Cixi employed him to be in charge of Chinese customs, this most important financial institution in China when it started foreign trade. And Robert Hart was in charge of Chinese customs for half a century, for as long as Empress Dowager Cixi was alive. And he made a great contribution to Chinese economy, contributing something like 1/3 of the national revenue. Now, when he went to Europe and he wanted to bring some, envoys from China to Europe, people didn't want to go, and there were all sorts of scary stories, and that the Chinese would be held hostages, they would be chopped up on the chopping board, and so on. So that was the kind of world from which Cixi changed. And she started to send the children abroad. This was in the 1870s, and these children were heading for America to receive comprehensive education. And then later they returned to China, and they became the pillars of China's modernization.
So often, the point that I keep taking from this book is what a master politician she was. So often she had people who were against her and were in opposing camps, and not only did she best them, but they ended up being her biggest supporters by the end. She had this ability to turn people around.
Yes, she was a consummate politician in almost modern sense, because emperors inherited their positions automatically. Cixi never had legitimacy. She was a woman. She was not allowed to rule, and so every bit she had to earn this. And I think that also actually worked to her advantage, that the fact that she was a woman, because the envoys from abroad started to tell her how women were treated outside China. Women could emerge in public, walking arm in arm with their husbands. They could dance. They could travel. All the things that she was dying to do herself. And so she was drawn to Western ideas and ways. And so China's modernization fell on this woman to start. One of her reforms was to ban foot binding. That's how I first really had some ideas of her, because before, of course, she was condemned, as you said. Even today, if you go on the internet, she's always condemned as the arch-conservative, the die-hard, ghastly despot who dragged China behind, and they fell on the communists and all the Republicans or the nationalists to save China from the mess she left behind. In fact, she was the person who started the modernization, and she banned foot binding. I discovered this when I was researching Wild Swans, and that struck me because my grandmother had bound feet, and Chinese women were subject to this torture for over 1,000 years. And my grandmother was my size, and her feet were like this. You see, foot binding was not just to put a piece of cloth around the feet. Only the big toe was allowed to grow, and the other 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone, and the binding was just to stop the broken bones from recovering. So from the age of 2, my grandmother lived in excruciating pain. Now, Cixi hated foot binding, and she banned it. And also she banned the death by 1,000 cards. She introduced the Western legal systems to reform China's medieval penal system. And she changed the Chinese educational system wholesale. Earlier you were talking about Cixi didn't have formal education, and that was because women were not allowed a formal education. But this may be her saving grace, because education before Cixi's change was to subject a 4-year-old boy to spending his entire days and nights, waking hours, reciting this incomprehensible, undigestible, whatever, Confucian classics, which even for adults was dry and impossible, let alone for a 4-year-old. I mean, you have to do this for 10 years to qualify as being educated. And that system was completely done away with by the Empress Dowager, and she introduced the Western educational systems. That's why in China today we have the same sort of school systems and so on. And so, here she didn't murder her own son. She sort of loved her own son. And she has she was ruling from behind the throne, behind the screen, when the son was a child. But when the son came of age, she had to retire back to the harem, and her son, the 16-year-old, took over. But like all 16-year-olds, perhaps not all 16-year-olds, and he just wanted to have fun and have sex, and not all 16-year-olds. And in particular, he sort of liked sneaking out of the Forbidden City to frequent male as female prostitutes. And he died before he was 18. And Cixi saw that how this son didn't work, but in terms of running the country and the modernization. And she put another 3-year-old on the throne. She adopted the 3-year-old nephew and made him the next emperor. And this was Emperor Guangxu. And Emperor Guangxu again had this Chinese education, and he grew up completely uninterested in the outside world. He didn't want to get out of the Forbidden City, and he had this phobia, in particular, of thunders. So when there was a thunderstorm, eunuchs would gather and shout at the top of their voice to try to drown out the thunders. Now, this emperor was in power in the 1890s when the Japanese spotted the opportunity and spotted that this giant country, China, was run by this man who had no idea of what the outside world was like. And Japan launched the war against China in 1895. And the emperor, by the way, Cixi was not a good mother to him. So the emperor was estranged from her adopted son, was estranged from her, and he didn't want to have anything to do with state policies. Instead, he relied on his classics tutor, grand tutor Wang Tonghe, to be his war advisor. Wang Tonghe was a renowned calligrapher and painter, etc., Confucian classicist, but he was no good at conducting a war. And of course, China suffered a tremendous defeat. And then, of course, foreign powers now suddenly saw this giant country was actually a paper tiger. So they all came to want to get a bit of China. The Germans came first and grabbed Qingdao and the areas around it. Have you been to a Chinese restaurant that had Qingdao beer? And that's because the Germans first made it. And the British grabbed a bit, and the French grabbed a bit, the Russians grabbed a bit, and that gave rise to the xenophobic Boxers. And those were the Boxers. They were not all over China. They were mainly in German-occupied Shandong, and later they got into Beijing. And some of you might have seen the film 55 Days in Beijing, in Peking. That was about the Boxers besieging the foreign legations. Now, Cixi, the foreign powers then invaded China, an allied army of 8 countries. Now, Cixi didn't want the invasion, although she was clamping down on the Boxers, but she also didn't want foreign armies to come. And she had no army, she had no navy, they'd been destroyed by the Japanese. So she then had made this fatal mistake, which she very much regretted later on, of using the Boxers to fight the invaders. She thought their hatred for foreigners would make them brave soldiers. But of course, they couldn't fight modern weapons, and they collapsed in no time, and they only committed more atrocities and violence, and the missionaries and Chinese Christians bore the brunt of their atrocities. And Cixi was driven out of the Forbidden City and Beijing by the allied army of 8 countries. And so we come to this, she's imperial concubine Pearl. She was the favorite concubine of her adopted son. By the way, before all that, I mean, of course, there were many details. Before all that, her adopted son had been involved in a plot to try to kill her. And the imperial concubine Cixi, imperial concubine Pearl, was also involved in that plot. And when they were fleeing the Forbidden City, Cixi didn't want to take this girl, this troublemaker, with her, so she ordered her to commit suicide. And Pearl, of course, said no, and so Cixi ordered her thrown into a well. And if you go to Beijing and in the Forbidden City, inevitably you're going to be led to see this Pearl, this well. But Cixi, she regretted all this during her exile. She apologized to the spirit of Pearl, to foreigners, to the people, whatever. During her exile, she issued a decree called the 自责之诏, the decree to reproach herself. And she then made peace with the foreign armies and returned to Beijing at the beginning of the 20th century.
So why do you think this terrible reputation that she has as someone who murdered 2 emperors, one of which was her son and one of which was her adopted son, although it is true that she did kill the adopted son in the end, just a very short time before her own death, a few hours before her own death. Yes. And this idea that she stripped the Navy of finances in order to build the Summer Palace for her own pleasure. Why do you think that is such a prevalent view? Why do you think that's what people believe?
Well, yes, I mean, first of all, we have to separate what is true, what is not true. I mean, it is true that Cixi murdered her adopted son, the emperor, the day before she died. When she realized that she was definitely going to die, she then had her adopted son, the emperor, who was by then a prisoner since the plotted coup to try to murder her, and she had him poisoned. And this was definitively established in 2004 when forensic examination of the emperor's remains and the clothing and so on have established that he had consumed 2,400 times of arsenic. Than the sort of what existed naturally.
But there was no question that she was doing this for her own benefit, because she only lasted one more day, and it was she knew that she was on the way out as well.
She was on the way out. Well, this is from her point of view. If she had died and he had lived, and China would end in the hands of Japan, because the Japanese had been trying to dominate China, to create this giant Asian empire, which was also Japan's ambition during the Second World War, a couple of decades, a few decades later. The emperor, Cixi's adopted son, was well disposed towards Japan, and he was also not very smart, and he wanted to go with the Japanese, very much like the last emperor. I don't know whether you've seen the film, The Last Emperor, Puyi, who became a Japanese puppet in northeast China, in Manchukuo, but 20 years later. But with Emperor Guangxu, it would have been the whole of China that would have become a Japanese under Japanese domination. Yeah, sorry. No.
So much I want to know. So what about this other allegation that she stripped so much money from the Navy to build her pleasure palace?
Right. Well, you see, the thing is, since the British burned down the old summer palace, and that had always been the most kind of painful thing for Cixi, because she loved it. She hated the Forbidden City. She said it was all walls and gates. And she wanted something that was nature. And she wanted to build, she was trying several times to try to restore at least a little bit of the old summer palace. Now, when she was building the Chinese Navy, Cixi, by the way, is the founder of Chinese Navy, and she bought with astronomical price, these ironclads, which had just been produced in Europe, and she bought modern fleet. She was modernizing the army as well, and the annual budget for the Navy was 4 million taels of silver. And at the same time, she also wanted to build her summer palace. And she made the mistake of taking actually a little bit, not the whole fund as some alleged, and not 2/3, not whatever. She took probably about 300,000, up to 300,000 a year, compared to basically it was the interest of the Navy funds deposited in the bank. She took some of the interest to build her summer palace. So in the period of 9 years when she built the summer palace, you see, going to Beijing, she took for probably between 5 to 6 million taels of silver. And that Chinese scholars have been doing research on this for many years. And the general accepted view among Chinese scholars is that the money she took didn't have made little difference to the Chinese Navy. But of course, it was corruption. It was unacceptable. She repented. I mean, later on, she used the palace money, she used the money that was designated for the royal family to build a grand headquarters for the Navy in Beijing. I mean, the only two turn of the century gorgeous buildings. I mean, today, of course, in tatters. In Beijing, if you are in Beijing, you probably should go and see. They are really quite gorgeous. One is the headquarters for the Navy, and the other was for the Army. And Cixi was said to have foot the bill.
Ladies and gentlemen, very soon I'm going to be opening the floor for your questions, so if you can get them ready. In the meantime, I just have one more. At the time of her death, she was actually undergoing enormous constitutional reform, putting in place the mechanics of what would turn out to be a constitutional monarchy. And it's amazing to wonder what would have become of China had she lived. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, she was working towards that direction. I mean, so if I may, we're at this picture of after her exile returning to Beijing, she was actually turning around and waving at a foreign photographer. And she had learned from her envoys abroad that foreign monarchs waved at their subjects. And this was her first wave.
There holding something?
Her skirts twirling, because Chinese monarchs were not to be seen. When they went out, huge screens would be erected to shield them from the public view. Now she did all sorts of reforms. I'll come back to this picture later. She did all sorts of reforms, and as I mentioned, her last reform was to turn China from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament. And that project was going to start in 1908. And she had set a period of 9 years. So at the end of the 9 years, the Chinese would, some Chinese, like in the West, most the men could only vote, would vote. one of the reasons she wanted to have this constitutional monarchy was actually to save her own dynasty, because she realized that in the increasingly enlightened China, she also introduced free press. Chinese press under her was, let's face it, much freer than it is today. But the criticisms of her, she tolerated and so on. In fact, that's another thing that struck me about her. Was when I was researching my biography of Mao, I realized, because Mao grew up under her, and I grew in her legacy, I realized how much freedom and opportunities Mao had, including writing for an incredibly free press. So now, how to the monarch? How do you make the monarch survive? That was a big question. Now, one thing Cixi was trying to hang on to was court etiquette. Whilst China was undergoing great changes, the court changed very little, and in particular, Cixi insisted on people going down on their knees to her. And with her permission, they could stand up. And because of this, she sacrificed some of her curiosities. She was an intensely curious woman. She tried the tricycle. She wanted to get into a hot air balloon. But she never rode in a car, although she was given a grand imperial car. And the insurmountable problem was that the driver, the chauffeur, could not drive while kneeling down, not even standing. The driver had to sit right in front of her. And so she then decided not to sit in the car. And so it was at the same time, then of course, you can't just sustain a dynasty by these symbolisms. So she started the constitutional monarchy, the change of constitutional monarchy. And unfortunately, she died when she just launched this project. She died in 1908. Now, on her deathbed, in the last 3 hours of her death, by the way, all this is all documented, from court documents, imperial edicts, courtiers' diaries, etc. Now, in the last 3 hours of her death, she finally reconciled to the idea that the constitutional monarchy most likely would not work in China. And the reason was that the ruling monarch, the ruling dynasty, was a Manchu dynasty. The Manchus were a minority. They were only 1% of the Chinese population. And they dominated China for over 200 years. And the Han Chinese, the vast majority of Han Chinese, it's very difficult for them to have loyalty to a Manchu monarch. While she was alive, she had the personal authority. But once she was gone, this probably would not happen. So she reconciled to the idea of China becoming a republic. And she made the arrangement. I won't go into the details, which is exactly what happened 3 years after her death. And China made an astonishingly bloodless and peaceful transition from absolute monarchy of over 2,000 years to a republic.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time now for your questions. We have an usher on each side with microphones waiting for you. And because we have quite a number of people here, I'd like to ask you to confine yourself to questions rather than comments. Thank you. Sir, in the middle, you're our first. Hello.
Hi. One of the most amazing things I saw in China was at the Summer Palace outside the Dowager Empress's little house. I think there's 5 statues of animals, and apparently when you say the animals' names phonetically, it says something lovely about the Dowager Empress. Do you know any of that story and how that came about?
No.
We've never heard that.
Oh, okay,
I'm sorry. There may be some legends.
But she was very famous for her love of animals. She loved animals.
She loved animals. Oh, yes, she loved animals. I mean, she did a lot. She bred the Pekingese, she bred dogs, and she bred birds. I mean, she could she could whistle a bird song and entice the bird to come to her fingertips. And she loved gardening. She gardened, she had orchards, and she loved nature. And also, okay, maybe then while I can't let go this opportunity of, she also, of course, as a woman, I mean, she loved to make herself look good. But as a widow, Chinese tradition was, if I may say, so awful. They won't allow widows to wear makeup. And so Cixi discreetly made, used the makeup. And she had her first photographs taken in 1903. And her photographer saw the prints and realized that this elderly lady, nearly 70, was not going to be very happy about these prints. So he airbrushed all the prints. So when Cixi saw the prints, she was thrilled. I mean, this obviously wasn't what her mirror had told her for years. So you can see this is a 1903 print, and she had them blown up to giant sizes and hung them in the Forbidden City, and she gave them to foreign heads of state as presents. And this is to thank the American president for his congratulations for her 70th birthday. And when the picture arrived in Washington, American press said she looked 40 rather than 70, and of course, the prints in the Forbidden City today are still these airbrushed ones, and the authentic ones are in America, in the Smithsonian, America's National Museum, and Chinese people are still studying what's the trick of Cixi to keep her usefulness, and the reason was the airbrushing.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Jung Chang.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Firstly, it's a delight to speak with you. Thank you. There is a character named George Morrison from a place where I come from, Geelong, who figures very largely in the Western biographies I've read. How largely does he actually figure in Cixi's life?
Well, I mean, he didn't figure in my book, I'm afraid, sorry, and because he doesn't speak in Chinese. Yeah, he is a foreign journalist. He relied on various sources to provide him with some truthful, others untruthful legends and stories. And he also very much relied on this man called Edmund Backhouse, who spoke some Chinese, who has been proved, whose works have been the kind of classic main source about Cixi, because he claimed he had an affair with Cixi. He was with Cixi at her last minute, and he claimed that, this is Backhouse, not Morrison, Backhouse claimed that Cixi's last words were, "Never allow a woman to rule." I mean, this was it's just so impossible. I mean, anyway, and he's been proven not just by me, but by British scholars from the 1970s as a literary forger. He forged the Chinese diaries and gave them to foreign correspondents. Now, sorry, what was I going to say? From that, I will talk a little bit about my sources, and my sources are entirely built on documents. I don't even have people to interview, unlike biography of Mao, because the documents about archive documents about Cixi and her dynasty are open. They are the first national archives in Beijing, and scholars have been working on them since Mao's death from the late 1970s. So they have compiled huge volumes of the complete works of Li Hongzhang, the complete works of the boxers, the imperial edicts, court diaries, etc. And the imperial decrees, a lot of them have been digitalized. And so I could even sit in my London study and bring the decrees to the screen. And for that reason, because I have this huge wealth of documents, I decided not to read anything that is not a direct first-hand, with first-hand knowledge of her and the court. And so from these documents, and of course many interesting things also emerged. Can I just talk about my next picture? Yeah. Cixi had, far from having this, she didn't have an affair with Edmund Backhouse, Sir Edmund Backhouse, but she did have an affair with a eunuch. When she was in her late 20s and early 30s, she fell in love with a eunuch called Anderhai, Little Anne. And she's so, you see those men, of course, around her were all eunuchs. Around her there were no men. There were no men other than the emperor and the eunuchs. So she fell in love with a very good-looking young man, and she wanted to make him happy. And she was carrying out reforms at that time, 1869. So she then sent him out of the Forbidden City and out of Beijing to sail down the Great Canal to southern China in order to celebrate his birthday. So he was able to celebrate his birthday with music and dancing on the barge, on the moon, on the Great Canal. And that caused the most gigantic storm, because eunuchs are still, even today, almost universally despised, particularly by men. And the eunuch is still a bad word, whereas, people should think how they became eunuchs. They were driven by poverty, to be subjected to this most painful operation. And they should really deserve sympathy. And the Empress Dowager actually had no prejudice against them. She had sympathy for them. And then her lover, unfortunately, was then arrested by a local grandee and was beheaded, and his corpse was exposed for 3 days, so the public could see he had no male organ. So it was ghastly, and she had a nervous breakdown for months. And she wasn't reading the descriptions of her medical record, and it was really a serious nervous breakdown. This was a woman who was no shrinking violet, and when she launched the coup and risked death by 1,000 cuts, she didn't so much as batting an eyelid. But so it was really her love for that man. And also many other eunuchs were executed by the grandees who were connected with Cixi's lover, and the women who performed singing and dancing were sold to the army soldiers on the frontier. So the costs of having an affair was so high that Cixi there was no record of her having any affairs.
We have time for one more question. Thank you. Ma'am.
Thanks for all the talk. It's very enjoyable. I have one question. It's particularly related to the source of document that you did happen to mention some. But are there more court documents, or are they actually, where are the source of document coming from?
Her dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Qing documents are in the 第一历史档案馆。The first the first historical archives, and that is situated in the Forbidden City. Since, as I said, since the late 1970s, scholars have been working on these archives. They are open. Actually, in 2008, I went to the archives and I consulted the archives. But of course, anyone who's worked in the archives know that if you get one piece of original paper, that is already a giant thing. I only spent limited time working in the archives, but most of the documents were compiled by scholars. I just named a few. And the imperial edicts are digitalized by the Guangxi Shifan Daxue, by the Guangxi Normal University. Anyone who speaks Chinese or who speaks classical Chinese can go on the internet and read those imperial edicts. And they can, the old courtiers' diaries, eyewitnesses' accounts, and so on, have been republished. Again, you can easily buy them. So it's not like when I was researching the biography of Mao, and John and I really had to dig out every bit of information, which is why it took us both 12 years. But with the Empress Dowager, it took me only 6 years. And the reason was, the sources are so abundant. The first imperial, the first historical archives alone had 12 million documents.
Thank you so much for coming along tonight. Please join with me in thanking Jung Chang.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.